Hello, how are you? Please welcome our special guest, Mr. Neil Gaiman, ladies and gentlemen. He's over the... He's going to sit here now. We're here.
Here we are.
Neil Gaiman.
In the peat mines.
How are you?
I'm very good.
It's nice to see you. I always remind you about your hair when I see you because it literally is like Ken Dodd just got dragged through a hedge again. But thank you for the hair, it's brilliant. Now, we're going to talk about Ocean at the End of the Lane. I want to talk about lots of things, but I've been told I can't. When did you start writing this story?
I started writing Ocean at the End of the Lane very early in 2012.
Oh.
My wife Amanda had gone off to Australia to make an album, and I missed her. And I went off to Florida. I borrowed a house from a friend, and I was meant to be writing a script and maybe doing another couple of projects. And instead, I found myself missing Amanda, and I thought, and because she was making an album, she wasn't really very much there. You know, it was a kind of thing where I'd be sending her emails going, hello, this is my day, and she'd write back and say, great. And I'd phone up and I'd say, I miss you, and she'd be saying, I'm in Australia making an album, bye. And so I thought, I've got to do something that will, you know, kind of get her attention.
Does she read everything?
No, she'll read things if she likes them. She's picky. She will occasionally grumble about things of mine, and I'll say, I didn't know you read that. And she'll be like, well, you know, not to the end. That's terrible.
I'm not sure you should be saying this about your wife on stage.
So I thought I'll write her a short story that she'll like.
Ah, good, a challenge.
And I thought, what does she like? Well, she likes me, and I was sort of a bit grumpy because earlier in 2011, I'd tried to take her to a few of the places from my childhood and failed because they weren't there anymore. And they weren't there anymore to the point where you could sort of go, well, you see this housing estate? This used to be a house over there and some fields down here, and these were the fields with the bulrushes where I used to read, and you have to use your imagination. So I thought, I'll write her a short story, and it'll be a short story it'll have me in it, and it'll have emotions in it, because she likes emotions, and it'll have a lot of the scenery of my childhood.
Hang on a minute. Yeah. Was this story, because I know you, was this something that was brewing anyway, or was it triggered by this stuff? Because
okay, it had started brewing. You can point to about 5 different places where it started brewing. It started brewing when I was about 9 years old, and my mother told me that Boyley's farm down our lane was in the Doomsday Book. And actually, I did a little bit of research and discovered actually it was 14th century, so it wasn't in the Doomsday Book. But at the time, I went, oh, it's 1,000 years old. And I started thinking, what would happen if the people who lived there had been living there for 1,000 years? Ooh. So the idea of incredibly old people in the farm, just living as farm people, had been in my head forever. Then about 1994, 1995, no, it must have been a bit later because it was after I got a Mini.
After you got a Mini?
I bought a Mini early in the 2000s when they started doing the new Minis. And my father was out, and he visited, back when he was still alive, and he visited us in a little Wisconsin house I was in. And I remember just talking about how much I loved the Mini, and the weirdest thing about having a Mini as an adult is they'd sort of scaled it up So, but it was still the same size relative to you as an adult human being as the little minis had been when you were a kid. So it actually didn't feel like the minis had got enormously bigger, even though they had.
But they were bigger.
They were bigger.
Yeah.
And I happened to say, in that sort of way that you say things, not even imagining there's an answer or a story. I said to my dad, I used to love that white Mini that you had. And I remember one day we came home from school and the Mini had gone, and instead you had this ancient Jaguar with old red leather seats that smelled like other people's cigars that you just picked up, you traded the car in for. I never understood why you'd got rid of the Mini. And he said, I never told you that. And I said, no, you never did. He said, well, back in 1967, he said, we had a lodger who came from South Africa, and he brought you couldn't take money out of South Africa back then, but his friends had all given him a lot of money to bring to the UK and bank for them. So he had. And one night he'd gone down to Brighton, and he started gambling at the casino in Brighton, and he kept gambling at the casino in Brighton, and then he thought he'd just sort of dip into their money to fix things.
The way you do.
The way you do. And
7! Come on, 7! He was that guy.
He was that guy. And then there wasn't any money, and he came back to the house. He took the keys to the Mini from the table, took a garden hose, drove down to the end of the lane, and Dad said at 5 o'clock in the morning there was a knock on the door. He'd been spotted by a milk van, a lorry picking up the milk, and I had to go down in my dressing gown and identify the body.
Oh my God, that's in the book.
So being an author.
You put that in the book.
Yeah.
But that's real.
Yeah. So being an author, as I am, instead of, really doing what I should have done.
Is this going to be in a book?
You will be in all the books, Lenny. Instead of going, that poor man, which I should have done, instead of going, what an awful thing, what was it like at 5 o'clock in the morning having to go and identify somebody, all I found myself doing was thinking, you mean something interesting happened when I was 7 and nobody told me.
You put it in a book.
And I thought, and I kept thinking about that, and I thought, what would have happened if I'd known? What would have, and I thought, that is a thing. It was like one of those little bits of grit that enters the oyster, and you start putting these little nacreous pearl layers around it.
I rang you after I read the book. Do you remember? And I said, "This is you, isn't it?"
What did I say?
You said, you did that noise on the phone, and I went, "Yeah, it's him." But it's kind of you, isn't it?
It is.
Could you talk about?
Yeah, it's a bit weird because the boy is definitely me, age 7. There's nothing that he thinks. There's nothing that he is. There's none of his opinions or anything about books or anything that weren't mine. And the house that he's in and the location that he is in is absolutely, with a few tiny changes, it's absolutely where it's the house that we lived in. The farm, I've swapped the location of 2 farms down the lane. There was Boyley's farm and Buss's farm, and I've moved Boyley's farm down to the end, the 14th century one, down to the end of the lane. And I stole the duck pond from a little weird abandoned gatehouse over the road from us that has long since been concreted over. I moved a few things around, but it's absolutely where I grew up, and it's what I feel like, and it was me. But the parents weren't my parents. I have 2 sisters. Neither of them is the sister in the book.
Was there anything you had to leave out? Because it's quite a broad palette of colours you're using.
The way that it got written was so peculiar and organic. I was saying earlier on, I set out to write a short story. that was the idea. I would send a short story to Melbourne, to Amanda, and then I would have her attention. So that was the theory. And instead, what would happen is I would write that day's writing, and I'd normally know what I was going to need to write the next day. But I couldn't see much further than that, but I was always vaguely convinced I was near the end. And that went on for day after day and week after week, and somewhere in there I sent an email to my publishers saying, I appear to be writing a novella. I'm really sorry, because I know how hard novellas are. You know, it was like...
What's the difference between a novel and a novella? What's the...
Length, words, number of words. It goes short story, novelette, novella, novel. And I started to write a short story. At some point in there, I was like, well, I'm writing a novelette. And then it was like, no, I'm writing a novella. And then when I finished it, and I actually finished it after Amanda got back from Australia in April, and she was mixing her album, and I was in Dallas, and I was typing it all in, and I finished typing it in, and I did a word count, and wrote a very surprised email back to all my publishers saying, I appear to have written a novel that none of you were expecting, and I'm really sorry.
What was Amanda's reaction when she read it?
She loved it, but I don't think I would be telling tales out of school to say I think her most primal response to it was actually seeing it on stage.
Yeah.
A week ago. We went to the press night last Wednesday, and I'd already, I'd seen it run through once. I'd been at various readings, I'd given notes and so on and so forth. So I knew that it was not unknown for me to get to the very end and find myself having to discreetly flick a tear away, which is something I'd read about in books but never had to do. But
I'm not crying, you're crying.
It's just the sort of thing where you just go like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that didn't happen. You didn't see that. But Amanda was just like, from halfway through the first act, she's just sobbing and just holding on to me.
Because you're talking about, even though you go into the realm of fantasy and witches and stuff, this is raw human emotion. We're dealing with very, very sensitive stuff here. This is a little kid who's in danger. And I really felt for that kid.
I love the fact that you do absolutely feel for him. I remember when the book was published, listening to one of those Radio 4 programs, and this one they had a male moderator and 3 women novelists and poets discussing, 3 books they'd all been given to read, and one of them was Ocean at the End of the Lane. And the moderator had been completely baffled by it. He was like, well, it's a book about, sort of magic and things. I'm not really sure why we were given this to read. And all of the women started talking about memory and the imagination and the way you process memory. And he was just baffled. He was like, but it's got witches in it. And it's like, well...
He didn't get it.
He really didn't get it, and they really did, which made it a sort of very glorious kind of conversation.
Now, Joel Horwood has written this adaptation. How hands-on? I know you can be hands-on.
Just to throw this in here as a small footnote.
Go on.
2 things. It's really weird that you said Horwood, because Joel's name is Horwood, but the house that we were on, it was on Harwood Lane. And
somebody's made a mistake.
I love the fact that I love that not you at all. I love that the conflation of playwright and location has happened.
Joel Horwood.
Joel Horwood.
Nice. Okay, so this dude wrote the adaptation. How hands-on were you? Because I know you to be quite hands-on when you want to be. How many drafts did you read? What was the process like?
So the initial process was I met Katy Rudd, the director, and Joel Horwood in 2016, and they said they wanted to do it, and I liked them. And it was just that thing of responding to the people and responding to the things they said and liking them and trusting them and saying, okay, well, go ahead. And initially they did a workshop. And the workshop had lots of the sort of the puppetry stuff that happens. They were looking at ways of doing things. And it also had a lot of sort of semi-improvised dialogue and things based on the book and actors workshopping it. And I just remember coming out of that and talking to them and saying, well, the puppetry stuff is amazing, but you need a script now.
Right.
None of that stuff that people were saying was what they're going to be saying, but this is process.
Yeah.
And then...
I guess they were just saying, let's put it out there and see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great thing about the National is you get to do the workshop. You get to find out
what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, and you get to play. And so they did. And then a little bit after that, I remember getting a call and having to talk to my agent because the National wanted to do another book of mine. And they wanted to do the other book of mine, and they wanted it to be here in the Olivier and a giant show and a really big commercial smash. And
those are good if you can do them.
well, it was mostly the fact that I thought we can only do one at the National, and the other one will be done commercially one day by somebody. And this is what we need subsidized theatre for. This is what, Ocean is small and delicate, and it needs work and love and tenderness, and I think they can pull it off. So I went, okay, we're going with Joel and Katy and Ocean, and the other one we're pulling. They don't get that one.
And when did it start to feel like it was coming together?
It just became, it was like a photograph developing. That was an analogy that means nothing to anybody here under the age of 40.
You mean like on your phone, like when you take a picture? You mean like when you take a picture on your phone, it's just there immediately? That kind of development? Or do you mean old-time development?
I mean old-time development where you start
back in the day.
You start out with a blank thing and then more and more detail comes through.
We don't have that anymore.
I know. So I'd go to a reading and it would be good and I would have notes and and the next time, and I'd come back 6 months later, and there would be another one, and I would have fewer notes, but more specific. And they needed, we all knew to begin with, if you're putting a novel on a stage, you're going to have to leave things out. And it's okay to leave things out.
What were the big things that, do people want to go la 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 now? Were there major things that were excluded, or was it just tiny things?
No. I mean, I don't think of a lot of things that are excluded as major because I think what Joel and Katy did brilliantly was go for the heart. My biggest concern was probably that in the theatre one, the boy's mum has died. She's dead. Mostly for reasons of compactness and storytelling. And also because it becomes much more about grief and loss all the way through. And I think that was probably the biggest thing toward the final read that I had to think about, and I remember going backwards and forwards on that with them and saying, okay, you need to do this right, because if it tips one way or the other, it becomes like a shoe that drops and then the other one never does.
Yeah. And difficult when it's a major story beat. I mean, that changes it a little bit.
It does. But actually, I think honestly, it's all for the best. Everything that they've done. It's so weird because normally when I see adaptations of mine, even ones that I like or love. When people are like, well, what did you think of it? How was it? My voice goes a bit high, and I go, well, no, it was really, it was really good. And whereas with this, it's just like, on.
I like it.
Well, I was on the Today Show last week, the morning of the election, where they couldn't put anything political on, so they had me reading a poem instead. And at
That
the
helped.
end, I did my best.
Thank you for trying.
And and at the end, they said, "Oh, and you've got a play on at the National." I said, "Yeah, it's Ocean at the End of the Lane." I said, "It is absolutely astonishing." They said, "Well, we'll be the judge of that." And I thought,
You've written so many amazing things. He's written a lot of amazing things. You've written so many amazing things. Are you at all precious when you get into the guts of adaptation? Because there's a lot to play with here. And there's a feeling, I was with you yesterday, there's a feeling of you can change this, you keep the spine of this. What's your boundaries with regard to adaptations?
I think with live theatre in particular, I tend to be kinder than I would be and more forgiving otherwise, because I think that theatre is so incredibly Darwinian. It's like, if it's bad, it's gone, and then you just quietly say, yeah, I think probably we won't ever give them permission to do that particular production ever again. And it just goes away.
So you're very good at seeing the things that work and the things that don't work.
I think what's really interesting for me, probably most interesting about Ocean, was feeling that what Joel, Katy, and their amazing, and it's not just them, it's everybody, including the puppet designers and the puppeteers and the amazing sets and the acting is glorious and all of that kind of stuff. What I love best is when I stop feeling like the creator and start feeling like part of the audience. Uh-huh. When that little part of me that's criticizing, taking notes or whatever, just shuts off, and I'm just sitting there enjoying it, wondering what's going to happen next, even though on some level I know.
That's good, isn't it? When you become a customer, when you start to enjoy it and forget that it's you.
I remember back when you and I were making Neverwhere all those years ago, you used to tease me for laughing
at your own jokes.
At my own jokes, when because I would have written
in the middle of a take.
I did actually spoil some takes by laughing.
And action is I love this joke.
It's true. But it is that lovely thing where on the one hand you wrote the line, and on the other hand now Howell Bennett and Clive Russell are saying it, and it's glorious.
I like all that stuff. Is there anything you want specifically the readers of the book and clearly they're different things, the play and the book are different, but when you put work out there, what do you want them to take away from this production and from the book?
I think for me, when I wrote Ocean, I wasn't sure how anybody was going to react to it, because I thought it is so personal. It's a book which, normally when I write a book, my intended audience is me in an alternate universe in which I've never read that book. Occasionally it's me age 7 in an alternate universe in which I've never read that book, but that's my audience. And this one, it was Amanda. So as long as she liked it, my book was done. What I didn't expect was a very specific thing that started happening, which was people would come up to me having read Ocean, and they'd say, "You wrote my life." And that was me as a kid. Nothing in there happened to me, but that was me. And the first couple of times it happened, I thought, this is an odd thing to happen. And by time 50, by time 100, it was just like, okay, there are a certain tribe of us, slightly booky people, people who, I remember when my daughter Maddie turned 9 or 10, and she was at that point my 3rd child, and I realized that she was the 3rd of 3 of my children not to alphabetize their bookshelves. Then maybe it was me. as far as I was concerned, by the time I was 7, I would agonize over, Richard Glyn Jones. Is he G's or J's? And
That was you.
that was me, and I was the one with my copy of Tales of Ancient Egypt. Roger Lancelin Green. Is he an L or a G? I don't know.
You take books to school. You know that day at school where you were allowed to take toys or comics or books to school? Were you that kid? Did you always take a book to school and just sit in the corner on that day?
I did.
And not play with anybody else?
And I was genuinely the first kid. There's a line in Ocean at the End of the Lane about being the cake shop doing the birthday. Said this was the first time they'd had to put a book on a cake. They normally did footballers or astronauts.
Yeah.
And
You had a book.
I was the first book.
Was it a specific book or just a book?
I think it was just a book.
Wow. That's very geeky indeed.
Yep.
I love you for it though, because had a very similar experience at school with books, and it was always a box of comics or a box of books, and just me sitting there while people played with Johnny Sevens and Hot Wheels and Dinky Toys. But I don't want to start crying, so I'm going to ask you another question. Is there a particular childhood memory that you focused on while you were writing this, or was there a palette of memories that you kept looking at and thinking, "Oh, I'm going to press that button now"?
I think what was really weird about writing it was while I was writing it, things that I hadn't thought about in years and years and years started coming back into focus.
Yeah.
And stuff that I'd absolutely and utterly forgotten because I'd had no reason to think of it. Suddenly I'm phoning my mum and saying, okay, let me just make sure that I'm remembering this right. So you'd go out the back door, and then there were 3 little weird outhouses, and there was one that smelled like coal, and then there was an outside toilet, and then there was one with a washing machine in it, and it was all sort of bricks, but they'd get mossy and slippery, and then there was some lilies of the valleys that grew alongside that, and then behind that was the black currant bushes. And you're sort of going, and it's all this stuff of a place that hasn't existed since 1970 or 1971.
You're just checking up on the detail.
But if you'd asked me to draw a map of the house the week before I started writing the book, I probably wouldn't have remembered any of that. But it really was this kind of thing of, okay, I was so into the location, so remembering every detail of the place. And that was, for me, the strangest thing. The back cover of Ocean used to have a photograph. Some editions have it, some editions don't, of me on the drain pipe, climbing down the drain pipe on the back of the house. And
that really happened?
That really happened. I used to climb up and down the drain pipe. My sister Lizzie found this photo for me and she sent it to me. And the photo is incredibly cunningly cropped, so you can't see the kid's face. Not because, not for the artistic reasons that you would imagine, just because the grin on my face was so huge that all of the kind of atmosphere of the book of childhood peril and weirdness and stuff
would have been sad.
It would have been just destroyed by this sort of I'm on the drain pipe. Kids in
Why were you climbing up and down the drain pipe?
Because kids in books went up and down drain pipes. And I read that in books, and I was like, okay, so we have a drain pipe. And fortunately, it was not a plastic drain pipe that would have come away from the house and killed me. It was an old-fashioned Victorian proper drain pipe. It was a very strange house that we were in, strange garden, because it was half of an old Edwardian manor house. Uh-huh. And the people next door had they had the posh half, and we had the servants' quarters.
But you weren't servants for them?
We were not servants for them. In fact, the doors had been bricked up. That would have joined the houses, which actually started another book, Coraline. Began with the fact that we got one nice room. So we had the servants' quarters, but we had a drawing room, which was wood paneled and stuff because it was at the front of the house. And it had the door through which the servants would have entered, which was ours, and then the door at the other end where the family would have entered, and you opened it and it was a brick wall. And that used to fascinate me. I used to creep up on it. Because I was
creep up on the wall?
On the door, yeah. Because I was completely sure that if I just open it right and open it fast enough, it wouldn't be a brick wall. It would lead somewhere.
Wow.
And so that was the starting point, 2-3 decades later of Coraline.
It's fantastic. Please go see it. Please buy the book if you haven't done it. Ladies and gentlemen, Neil Gaiman.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.